Hello, everybody, and welcome. It's 2 p.m. Eastern Time in the United States, and I'm Lesley Slavitt, the Executive Director of the Dorothy Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University. Starting to really be excited by all the wonderful places people are joining us from, so really encourage everybody to continue to sharing about themselves and their location, places I've visited and places I've always wanted to be, so excited and jealous at the same time. Um, and as we get ready to get started here, I just want to let you know how delighted we are to host this 11 Trends in Philanthropy webinar for 2025. It is the Johnson Center's 9th annual report, which aims to help the sector anticipate and embrace what's next and what's moving. Delighted here. We may see up to 800 locations here in the chat. We have registrations at around 800 here today, so people from clearly all across the globe. And so I will just say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And with that, I'd just like to share a few notes before we begin our conversation here today. So the first is that the webinar is being recorded and anticipate that a link will be shared within a week. If you have any technical issues or want to participate in the conversation, which we completely encourage you to do, please use the chat feature on today's webinar. The second half of today's conversation will be a Q&A with all of the panelists. Please submit your questions to the Q&A, which you can do at any time, but any technical issues, please go to the chat. But otherwise, as soon as we begin, which we'll do in a moment, really encourage you to start sending questions that we'll be in conversation with the panelists on. And speaking of our panelists, it is truly my pleasure and great joy to introduce our three panelists with us today. The first is Aisha Benson. She is CEO of the nonprofit Finance Fund. With 3 decades of experience in community development finance, Aisha is a former EVP and COO of True Fund Financial Services, where she oversaw lending, tax credit deployment, and advisory programs. She also has held previous roles at Carver Federal Savings, Banco Popular, and JP Morgan Chase. Across her career, Aisha has collaborated to deploy hundreds of millions of dollars in loan and grant capital to low-income communities. So delighted to have you with us here, Aisha. It's also my honor to introduce Aaron Dorfman. Aaron has been Executive Director of the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy since 2007. Prior to that, Aaron spent 15 years as a community organizer, leading grassroots campaigns on public education, public transportation, and affordable housing access. In addition, Aaron is a frequent speaker and writer on diversity and philanthropy, Foundation's role in funding for advocacy and community organizing, as well as accountability and transparency in the philanthropic sector. And now, Alan Smart. Alan is a rural philanthropy expert and consultant for regional and national foundations. In December 2024, he retired. Let's really not believe that because I think it's not really true. From the consultant group, he founded Philanthropy Works, which focused on supporting rural community-focused philanthropy. Alan has been a regular writer for the Daily Yonder and Inside Philanthropy, where he was recently profiled as the rural giving guru. In addition, throughout his career, Alan has been a frequent speaker for national and regional organizations, including Philanthropy Missouri, Indiana Philanthropy Alliance, as well as the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy. But before we get into this really exciting conversation, I want to share a little background about what makes a trend, and just reconnect everybody to the 11 trends for this year. So I often get asked, what makes a trend? And a trend is a topic or issue that's moving. It's not always entirely new or completely novel, but we're moving. It's moving, and we need to understand how it's moving. In addition, I'm proud to say a trend is also something that every member of the Johnson Center for Philanthropy comes together to produce. It is a trend that is reflective of the unique skills and insights and dedication of all the colleagues I'm privileged to work with at the Johnson Center. And this, as I said, is the Johnson Center's 9th year producing the report. So that's 99 trends. And a look across tells us an interesting story about how needs and ideas both advance and fade in the sector. Sometimes they're replaced, other times they're not. And speaking of times, one must always situate the trends retrospectively and in visionary ways in the context of our time and clearly that's a world that is not static. And so a little overview of this year's trends before I go through the 11. They represent a wealth of research, data, and examples that are fundamental to the sector. A couple highlights and ways of framing how we can think about the conversation we're about to have is that we're still seeing the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the strong growing demand for resources continue to play an important role in many of the trends. These trends explore truths we must understand in order to best manage forward. In addition, we see something of collective action as a theme throughout many of the trends, indicating an evolution of the ways in which we think about philanthropy, what it means to give, and who is a philanthropist. And another key theme is about the public sector. These trends frame how uncertainty plays out and has meaning for the independent sector and its future. And so now we're going to go through a quick-ish, I'll be as quick as possible, review of the 11 trends, and then we'll begin today's discussion. So collective giving is a philanthropic phenomenon with deep roots in global traditions of community philanthropy, mutual aid, religious traditions, and many other forms of giving. The Johnson Center has been able to intimately watch and document this movement over the past decade, and the growth we've seen has been truly extraordinary. With over 370,000 individuals alone in the US engaged in collective giving from 2017 to 2023, this has moved over $3 billion into communities. These numbers indicate that more than 140% growth in both participation and total monetary donations across the movement since its most recent landscape study that we co-led at the Johnson Center in 2017 to the most recently jointly published work in 2024. Our current research suggests that participation in this movement and its impact are likely to double again in the next 5 years. So that's over $6 billion. Lobbying activities were already increasing over the past 20 years. This work has exploded, however, in the past 3 weeks in response to executive actions, but 2 factors we noted in our trend have played a particularly important role in the sector's response so far. First, the sector built many successful advocacy and lobbying coalitions during COVID. These networks have been able to move together in more agile ways because they've already had connection to one another. The second is that lobbying activities are likely to increase as a sector, especially when organizations have examples of lobbying wins to point to, which we do. So we're expecting an increase, but we know as we build successes and have shared experiences of accomplishments, we do even better and we go to that even more, which is maybe a better way to say that. Now to what we've been seeing over the past decade. So within the last 10 years, estimates were that between 9 and 12% of foundations were in what's called spend down mode, with about a quarter considering the idea, and that's organizations with a clock, a date by which they're going to close their doors and turn off their lights. New research by the National Center on Family Philanthropy in 2025 found that in the past 5 years, the number of family foundations exclusively in active spend down rose from 9% to 13%, and that more than 28% were considering it. We call that spend down curious. While the landscape research on this trend remains limited, there are other numbers that tell the story. The number of workshops, thought pieces, conference sessions, and headlines on the topic that paint a clear picture of the growing interest in spend down or sunset or sunrise as a practice. Between 1969 and today, Congress enacted 2 significant rewrites of the tax code, one in 1986 and the other in 2017. Many of the provisions included in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, including changes to individual income tax brackets and many other adjustments, expire in 2025. Congress will be addressing these expiring provisions, and we think likely very soon. We know that the sector will be under greater scrutiny in the tax conversations this time around, as much as it felt it was in 2017. The sector is always seeking to be part of the conversation to help shape policies that will impact our work and our missions. Ahead of the Tax Cuts and Job Act in 2017, we were often speculating about the potential impacts of the proposed changes. Well, now we know. A 2024 working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research determined that the act had resulted in a $20 billion decline in 2018. By 2034, older Americans will outnumber children for the first time in the United States' history, amplifying the urgency to address their unique needs. Although the number of grant makers funding aging services has surged by 225% in the past decade, nonprofits and philanthropy face critical challenges related to this topic. These include a couple of the following. 1, declining volunteerism among adults. 2, evolving donor demographics. For instance, age has become less of a predictor of charitable giving. Instead, household income has become a better indication. And retirement costs are growing, and in fact, a large portion of Americans cannot afford to retire. We can especially look to Alan Smart, one of our wonderful panelists, as we dive into conversation to give us a larger insight and look into what's happening here, because we know 1 in 5 older adults live in rural designated communities, but then only 6% of large foundations direct grants to rural areas. So Alan, heads up to you. Giving Tuesday was launched in 2012 to encourage generosity during the holiday season. The Giving Tuesday Data Commons estimates that Giving Tuesday has raised $13 billion since its first year, on average $1 billion a year. Giving Tuesday has also spurred a plethora of similarly structured giving days that now are sprinkled across the giving year. Giving days are especially effective as well for engaging new donors. We're watching the impact of these, what we're calling spread out giving days, on the traditional giving calendar. While most donations are still made during the traditional end of year season, giving days can shift budget and resource planning for individual organizations away from that time and may have a bigger impact on the field overall. So we're watching it closely. The narrative of decline is clear in volunteerism. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, over 27% of the population aged 16 and over volunteered in 2022. By 2002, sorry. By 2019, that would be 17 years later, that number had climbed to 30%, but it dropped to just over 23% in 2021. As we all know, it's hard to plan around variability. As well, it's not likely that traditional forms of volunteering will come back in full force. Here's kind of what we expect to see instead. More bite-sized engagements when individuals and groups can work with organizations on short-term, discrete tasks, as well as virtual engagements. To ensure a thriving cultural volunteerism into the future, however, other aspects of how we think about and support volunteering will need to change. Additionally, philanthropy has long focused on measurable, formal acts of volunteerism to understand and assess the landscape. But broadening our conception of philanthropy, we can tell a different story about where we're headed in the state of generosity in the U.S. Even when 23.3% of adults over 16 said they formally volunteered in 2023, 51% also said they helped their neighbors and friends in some way. And so definitions and how we think about the work really matters. The healthcare profession has obviously endured an onslaught of crises these past decade. By 2026, however, we're projected to have a shortage of over 3 million healthcare personnel, including doctors, nurses, allied health professionals, in order to meet the demands for care that we'll have. Mega philanthropists and public nonprofit sector collaborations are leading a response to this crisis. We've seen many gifts of $100,000 and more, including 2 $1 billion gifts. And within the public-private partnerships, we know that there was an apprentice program in Missouri using ARPA funds and federal appropriations to create an industry-driven healthcare program. We also know in the state of Michigan that CARES Act funding was used to establish a scholarship program for eligible Michigan state residents to get free tuition education at community colleges if they were going to focus on healthcare professions. So a lot is happening there. Philanthropic commitments and responsive public opinion in support of social justice movements peaked at the beginning of this decade in response to the tragic murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and many others. But over the last half decade, since 2020, both have receded. It's difficult to quantify shifts in funding to social justice, given how much of the money identified for these causes in 2020 was pledged rather than immediately dispersed. Estimates are actually in the billions of what the gap is. And so those declines align with drops in public support for social justice efforts. The Supreme Court's decision on affirmative action and the settlement of the Fairless Fund case instigated major changes across philanthropy and especially in higher education in 2024. The new administration's policies and executive orders related to DEI are having a chilling, and one could say even freezing effect. Funding for democracy, including efforts to support voting rights and access, free and fair elections, and informed citizenry, civil public discourse, has grown hugely since 2016. Grantmakers spent $9.7 billion on democracy efforts in 2022 alone, nearly twice the total from 2018, with all indications of a continuing upward trend. What we wanted to look at was how this movement has been experimenting and learning over the past 8 years as the overall numbers have increased. The new administration's actions are raising questions about the relationship between government and the philanthropic sector that will undoubtedly impact the movement for democracy funding. Panelists, get ready to reflect on this trend. Just a warning, because my next one is my last trend, and then we'll be moving to be in conversation with each other. The nonprofit sector is currently facing significant workforce challenges that threaten its capacity to serve communities effectively. I will share below sobering statistics with you. High vacancy rates. 75% of nonprofits have reflected on experiencing persistent job vacancies, especially in program and service delivery roles. Increased burnout concerns. 95% of nonprofit leaders are worried about staff burnout. Financial strain on employees. 22% of nonprofit employees lived in households unable to afford basic necessities like housing and healthcare. This disproportionately affects minority workers and those in social assistance roles. And finally, there's a funding disconnect. Many nonprofits have had to close due to unexpected shifts in funding, and obviously there's much more to discuss there. And with that, I ask everybody here today from all across the world to please join me in welcoming our panelists and in thanking Aisha, Aaron, and Alan for being with us today. Before we begin our dialogue, so just one more second, I would really like to ask each of the panelists to spend a minute or two sharing their top-level reflections on this year's trends report. Then we are going to be in conversation together for about a half hour, 25 minutes, after which the panel will field questions from the Q&A. So again, please put your questions into the Q&A. I'll give about a 5-minute warning, Alan, Aaron, Aisha, before we transition to the Q&A so we can wrap it up. But if you would please join me, I'm going to turn the panel over now to Aisha to please reflect for a minute or two on what you see in this year's trends. Aisha, over to you.
Sure, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Again, Aisha Benson, I'm the CEO of Nonprofit Finance Fund. For over 40 years, we have been working with nonprofit organizations to support them with capital and consulting services. We've deployed over $1 billion in funding to nonprofits nationwide. We're headquartered in New York. And last year, we formally added advocacy as a third pillar of our work because we know it is so important that as we see these trends in philanthropy, that we're able to amplify the voices of our nonprofit partners in the areas where they are experiencing challenges or where there might be opportunities to unlock that would help them to adapt and thrive and be more impactful in their communities. As I reviewed the report, I felt like it was spot on for the experiences that many of our nonprofit partners have been sharing. And as a community development financial institution, which NFF is, we partner closely with philanthropy to be able to provide consulting services, maybe even to unlock very low cost to no cost capital to deliver our missions. And so what we've seen is where we've seen the most parallels and alignment with what was surfaced in your reports was around sort of collectivism and collective giving, where we're seeing donor groups coming together, where we're seeing foundations coming together, and working along with community to lift up local challenges, local solutions, and even locally governed solutions, even to advance the aspirations of community, but also then to have broader impact. So that is one that we've seen very closely, and I know we'll probably dig in a little
Yep, and
bit
we were
more.
going to dig in more. Aisha, thank you so much for being here, and thank
Yes,
you for your insights
yes,
and reflection. I'm going to
thank
turn
you.
things, Alan, over to you, and then we'll go to Aaron. So Alan, to you.
Hey, greetings all. Alan Smart with, as Lesley indicated, yeah, my wind down of my consulting practice, which has been under the umbrella of Philanthropy Works for the past 7 or 8 years. Was a funder for about 20 years, all in the rural space. So yeah, I'm really thankful to be here. I'm sure the Johnson Center folks had to, winnow down from a long list to get to the trend report that you see in front of you. I just picked out four to give a very high level response. First, this whole notion of spend down for foundations who had assets generated or cultivated in rural places, but there's no longer, as we're moving on to generation 3, 4, 5, and probably 6, no longer real family presence in the community. It's a really interesting idea that I think both family foundations and community foundations could really harness some real investment with intentionality that perhaps hasn't been pursued previously. It's a really interesting concept I haven't seen discussed. Second, aging in place, older adults in rural. Lesley gave us some good numbers. There is a crisis in aging services in rural. There's an incredible um, theme of rural nursing home closures, for example. The availability of ways that older folks can age in place, either from the service side or kind of residential options, has always been limited, seems to be even more limited these days. Economic factors causing adult children to move to more urban areas, and people just don't have many options to live in the way they would have liked to. The healthcare marketplace, I've been working on healthcare professional shortage for 35 years now, probably. And while I appreciate the data that was presented in the report about these very, very large gifts to medical schools, for example, and some other kind of structural philanthropic contributions, I would still maintain from the rural side, unless there's some real rethinking of in every professional part of healthcare, whether it be medical school, nursing school, mental health providers, substance abuse providers, community health workers, unless there's some restructuring of who gets in these schools, how they're supported, where they're recruited from, we're essentially just providing more opportunities for the same people to enter healthcare professions. And
Right,
the last,
I'm
yep,
gonna
mhm,
Yeah, really quick, Alan, because the
yep.
Q&A is like lighting up like crazy. So when I get to
Yeah.
Aaron, I get us in
Yeah, the
conversation.
last one I just picked up, which you don't often see associated with rural, is kind of the opportunities for philanthropy and social justice around climate, environmental degradation, immigration, and just the inherent power dynamics historically and currently in many rural places.
Thank you, Alan, very much. Aaron, over to you.
Thanks, Lesley. Great to be with you all today. NCRP is the only independent watchdog and critical friend of philanthropy. And, we're just over 3 weeks into the new administration. And I think that it's clear that those of us who care about democracy and justice have a huge fight on our hands. And philanthropy can and must play an important role. And I just want to lift up 4 quick points from the Trends report. First of all, we've got to invest in grassroots organizing and movements, including making both C3 and C4 funding available. It's not just about nonprofit lobbying, as the trend has been noted, but it's about building power with those who have been oppressed in our society and who are fighting for liberation. Second, we've got to move more money. The trend towards spend out foundations is great, but too many large philanthropies are sticking closely to the 5% payout when this moment requires a greater investment, as many of them did in the early days of the pandemic. Freedom Together Foundation has announced they'll have a payout rate of 10% for the next few years, but where are the other large funders? Third, we've got to stand strong on funding for racial justice. The pullback in recent years that you spoke about after a surge in giving, it's disappointing to say the least. And the new administration is making some funders run scared. So we've got to stand up. If foundations can't take risks, who can? Fourth, we've got to understand how the anti-democracy forces are using philanthropy to keep people from voting. NCRP has a report coming out soon that uncovers an unbelievable amount of funding for voter suppression from 3,500 different foundations. Our side needs to match the intensity and focus of the Anti-Democracy Coalition. So I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks a lot. And I want us all to be in conversation together because the perspectives that you all bring will add sort of surround sound, light and heat on the important issues we're talking about today. And I want to build on what you were just addressing, Aaron, to talk about, what should the future of democracy funding look like? What is the perspective that you can offer and bring to help empower, or, what we'll be talking about is trending 2 years from now. Where do we want to be into the future, and how do we get there?
Yeah.
Aaron, you're up, and everybody feel free to join in.
Well, we are outgunned. They have been outspending us. The right wing has been moving this anti-democracy agenda for 50 years, using their philanthropy to do it. And we've got to get in the game and be more systematic. Yes, there's been a fair amount of pro-democracy funding, but frankly, our side is a bit more squeamish about what they're willing to fund. So we've got to be bolder. Certainly, legal advocacy is going to be part of that, protecting voting rights, overturning some of the most egregious elements. But when you've got right-wing groups closing ballot drop boxes in majority Black cities all over the country, it has an impact on the elections. And it's something that we can counter, but we've got to invest heavily in it and be thoughtful, strategic, and bold.
Alan, what's your perspective from a rural point of view? What would you say to what Aaron has shared? You're on mute. We'd love to know.
There's actually been some hopeful movement in the last 10 years or so. I mean, really, rural democracy work is all about community inclusiveness that might relate to newer immigrants or folks who have not been at the table before. Often in rural places, you have a small number of people who control the means of economic opportunity, decide who gets elected. There's kind of a shadow government aspect to it. And there's certainly some funders, I'll name Landon Foundation Minnesota just as one, who are really working with a good deal, I think, of intentionality about broadening who engages with them in rural places. But importantly, what does civic discussion look like in rural? And I wouldn't have said that 15 years ago. I don't know if I would have said it 10 years ago. The last 5 or 7 years, I'm more hopeful.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate that. And I want to go back to Aisha, where you had situated us, because it also seems to resonate across, what Alan and Aaron were reflecting on, this notion of collective action. And you really picked up on that. And I'd love if you're able to give a little more framing to how you think about collective action in the sector. There's obviously different ways it shows itself up in the 25 Trends report, but would love some of your expansive thinking on that, Aisha.
Yeah, sure. And before I say that, I have to say that voter suppression is still real. It's still alive. It's still happening in many communities. And therefore, I really encourage folks like the National Endowment for Democracy and others to begin to think about ways to fund democracy projects. And even some of the, I see a lot of connecting that to collective action. I see a lot of funders starting to come together around best practices and learning forums to see what are the different ways to support and advance democracy goals. And that's sort of happening with other issue areas, other emerging areas in community where you have different funder groups coming together and thinking about how to be really maybe innovative, right? And to think about crowdsourcing the funding that is necessary. And when that happens, you can actually mobilize, billions of dollars, as you saw in your report, from the 140% growth in participation and total monetary donations across the collective giving movement. So more giving circles are happening, like the Asian Lunar Giving Circle, Women Moving Millions. We see at the foundation level, C3, right? That is the Catalytic Capital Consortium. They're taking bigger, bolder bets together. Right? How do we even get the nationals like Ford and RWJF that's come together with Amalgamated and others around the housing crisis? There has to be more push and more movement at all levels of the philanthropic sector to think about how collective action can come together in the form of learning and in the form of giving to move some of these social issues that we've been experiencing.
Thank you. And I want to bring us sort of back to what I feel like is the center. We're talking about the action of doing the work. And if you look at the nonprofits who shoulder this work forward, we particularly had the nonprofit workforce in crisis. These are not a hierarchy of trends in 1 to 11, but I think it was particularly poignant to center us at the end on the pressure on the sector. And if we don't have the human capital that's well resourced and supported, this no work will get done, right? We rely on this part of the sector to drive the work and to accomplish the work and to do the work. And so, I went through some incredibly sobering statistics, and I urge everybody to sort of take a look at the 1,000 words, not just a few of the data points that I pulled out. But let's talk about what can we do? How do we have a trend that says the nonprofit workforce is thriving and not in crisis? What does it take? That's open to all the panelists. Would love different perspectives on that so we can do empowering, correct, needed work.
Yeah, I think a lot of the answer is in the advocacy, right? You mentioned how many of the community groups coming together was able to lobby around the PPP to ensure that nonprofit organizations would have access to those crucial dollars. And so what are the other policy issues where we need philanthropy to push, alongside the nonprofit sector to ensure that the barriers that they have to doing work, are removed, or so that access to capital. There's so many federal programs where dollars are eligible to, by nonprofits, but it's not written for a nonprofit because it's asking for things like a guarantor, right? Nonprofits will not have a guarantor, right? So going back even to, legislation, the way programs are designed, to really think about lobbying in that way, I think, is something that can help. And if I could just also just say on volunteerism, we see the trend of volunteerism going down, and it's not a surprise to me. First it was COVID, so people were not going into, organizations to help. But then we had inflation, right? And so people were like, I don't have the gas money to even drive to the organization. I can't buy milk, I can't buy eggs. And, so, finding I need to work. I don't have time to volunteer. But there needs to be some support for organizations around volunteer engagement. Philanthropy can do that. They can provide dollars for hours. They can encourage their employees and other corporate employees, corporate giving to support volunteerism across nonprofits.
And it's interesting, and I'm gonna, I saw Alan come off, oh no, Aaron, my screen is 2-0. Aaron's come off mute, and I was gonna go right to you because I want to look at things and have ideas for both things that are short-term help and structural solutions, right? It can be a both and. We don't have to be binary in our choices. So what does that look like? Aaron, thanks for coming off mute. There you go.
The health of the nonprofit workforce is vitally important, and there are a few things that can be done. One, funders can provide more unrestricted general operating support and be willing to pay for overhead in their grants. We still have way too many funders who don't want to pay salaries. Well, who does the work? Like, people do the work. So that's one thing that grant makers can do. There's an organization I'm a big fan of called Fund the People that has lots of recommendations about how do we improve the health and care of and the vitality of the nonprofit workforce. I think defending government funding for nonprofits is critically important in this moment as well. We have decided as a society that some of the government services that we want to provide for the citizenry should be provided through nonprofit organizations, and the government contracts with them. And we need to honor those contracts, and we need to keep those dollars flowing so that folks can pay their employees and serve the people of their communities.
And Alan, I would love to turn to you from your experience and insights and perspective on this.
Yeah, my kind of rural lens on this is philanthropy has been reluctant, although I feel there is some renewed energy to view the health of nonprofits and the viability and vitality of rural places as really tightly connected. Many rural places have sustained one way or another without a particularly healthy nonprofit sector, depending on state and federal government programs. But the notion of philanthropy, not just bringing nonprofits and government together, for example, but really being kind of the flag waver for this idea that a thriving rural community is not appealing for people who live there. Will not be appealing either for people who live there or people who might want to move there if there's not a kind of a thriving nonprofit sector. And that's just not an area that philanthropy has really taken on or seen the connectivity. But in rural places, it's particularly important. The future of a rural place and the future of nonprofit sector, there's no separation between the two.
And do you see that across mission and purpose, or do you have is there something in particular from your experience and knowledge that makes you say that, other than the sort of incredibly deep and general wisdom of that? Are there specific things that make that tie?
Yeah, I think philanthropy could be quite powerful in helping nonprofits engage with elected officials, for example, or in helping nonprofits engage with local regional university folks or healthcare institutions. Many rural places, the economy currently as it stands is healthcare. And so the disconnect often between some old school, some new nonprofits, and actually being able to have real conversations with local healthcare institutions, many of which are owned by, out of state or out of town urban corporations now. Just philanthropy's ability to champion, lead, support, whatever language we want to use, It's kind of sitting there for philanthropy to really use their tools, and it's not even necessarily financial investment. That's as much human capital, and it's just not happening in a thematically general way as it should.
Thank you. Anybody want to bring some perspective to the geographical insights that Alan gave before we move to our sort of final part of the conversation? Because we are beyond our 5-minute warning, and the Q&A is heating up. Time has never gone so fast for me, I tell you, every year on this webinar.
Gosh.
But any insights or reflection first, Aisha, or anybody on what Alan shared?
Yeah, so I want to comment on both what Alan and Aaron shared. It's hard, but I've done a lot of work in rural communities through the New Market Tax Credit Program, and you have dire conditions there where folks are needing healthcare, specialty care, and they have to travel 50, 80, even 100 miles to get that care. And there are nonprofits that want to step up and provide solutions, but they have huge gaps in the capital stack in order to be able to move those projects forward. What I see happening in the northern parts of the country is that there are foundations that are filling the gap. They're coming in, they're a part of that, whether it's through the capital campaign or some other way, they're bringing in funding. And I'm not seeing that as much. The regional and the local foundations and rural markets are just not as equipped. They don't know as much about these programs, and they don't have the same resources. So that's a disparity that I've seen over the years.
Do me a favor, before you go to the next point, which I really want you to make, describe a little bit about the capital stack for people so they understand kind of how that comes together.
Yeah, so I mean, to fund a project, you can have equity, you can have grant capital, you can have low cost debt, you can have debt that is at a higher rate, you can have tax credits, right? All of these sources of funding, bond financing, can come together to make a project go live, right? To pay, to cover the full costs of development. And often these projects include workforce components too, which are so necessary for job training and helping people move through their careers. So we need dollars. We need more dollars to flow, and only 6% of national foundations are only giving 6% of their dollars to rural communities. Like, we've got to do something about that.
Thank you. And then the other point you wanted to make in response to Aaron?
Yeah, very quickly, just the retrenchment and the move away from trust-based philanthropy practices that were really adopted and practiced by so many organizations after the murder of George Floyd. Smaller budget, nonprofits led by people of color that often had more restrictions. Studies show it. We're opening up their practices to give more unrestricted capital, to have less, restrictions in the reporting, just to make the process easier. And we cannot retrench there. Philanthropy, you need to open up your coffers. You need to give more than 5%. Even those that are giving 5%, some of that money is going to admin. It's not even going direct, to organizations. So we need you to think better about the nonprofits are the experts. They know what it takes to get the work done. Come alongside them and partner, and don't be paternalistic in this work.
Thank you very much. And now I think I'm going to do a bridge to sort of thank the panel and move us into the Q&A. And I think there's a great question to bridge us, because I was just going to the tax cliff. And there are a lot of questions in the Q&A about that, and which ask the panelists to talk further about the tax cliff and in particular its impact on nonprofits. So do I have somebody who wants to field a question and first respond about the tax cliff we're facing in 2025?
I can take a stab at it, Lesley.
Please, thank you.
So all of the tax cuts in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed in 2017, expire in 2025. Congress is expected to extend some of them or all of them. There are a few that I think are really relevant and important to philanthropy. Number one is the estate tax. In the lead up to the passage of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, everybody assumed that there was going to be a full repeal of the estate tax. but NCRP, independent sector, and a few other allies really pushed hard to help members of Congress understand the impact that would have on charitable giving if they eliminated the estate tax entirely. And, you know, the estate tax is not the only reason people give to philanthropy, but it's part of the motivation. It's part of the motivator. And we had a period in our past where we, in fact, eliminated the estate tax. And sure enough, charitable giving fell off a cliff when we did that. So, so that's one of the things I'm looking at is, you know, what they did in 2017 was they doubled the exemption, but they did not fully repeal the estate tax. I'm looking for no further backsliding on the estate tax because it's a huge motivator for charitable giving. And I see that Dan Pedagorski is on this call, and he was key in our efforts to push that back in 2017. So other stuff, though, perhaps even more important is what are the resources that the federal government is going to have to play its proper role in society, which then leaves philanthropy free to play a complementary, not a substitute role to government in pursuing the common good. In every issue area that donors care about, philanthropic giving is dwarfed by government spending on that issue. And if we keep extending all of these tax cuts and don't raise enough revenue so that government can play its proper role in society, people will be looking to foundations and donors to fill in the gaps, make up the difference. And that's not philanthropy's best role. Philanthropy is best as a complement, not a substitute to government spending. So how much revenue are we going to generate? And that's, to me, something I'm really looking at in the 2025 fights.
Thanks. Alan, Aisha, anything you'd like to share, Ed, about the upcoming tax code rewrite?
No, just to refer everybody back to the report that showed the $20 billion decrease, right? That happened when there were the first tax cuts back in the first Trump administration, right? We don't want to see that happen again.
Thank you, Aisha, and thank you, Aaron, for those insights and reflections. I'm going to kind of try to go through a lightning round. We have lots and lots in the Q&A, and I want to get to as many questions as we can. And I'm pulling out one which caught my eye, which says, "Good evening from Switzerland," was the way it started. So I'm passing along "Good evening from Switzerland." And then go back to the conversation we were having on the trend about democracy funding. They're particularly interested to know if we're seeing any evidence in the U.S. That's defocusing on democracy funding, like if we're starting to see a shift in that, and what does that look like in an international context? Do we have any perspective on what that means? So given the domestic situation and what we've been talking about and what we're seeing, can anybody sort of extrapolate and think about that in the context of international or global funding? That's a big question. I can break it down into bite-sized thoughts. So first is anything in terms of a new way of democracy funding happening in the United States. Is there some sense of what you think we'll see it, aside from what we sort of talk about in the report, that you can give reflection on that you think will or really should be happening in the many months or 12 or a year ahead? All right, we had a robust conversation, and the report is largely on domestic issues, and so the international context of our discussion here was not as much meant to be able to address that, but I think we see changes obviously in what's happening in the US's global engagement in the world. We've started to hear conversation from major US foundations about domestic and international priorities and where strategies will go. And so I think it's really a moment of things in flux, and they're about to start to play out, I think, is the way that's fair to sort of cast them. And so, Alan, I'm specifically turning to you because this didn't say hello, Alan good evening, Alan from Switzerland. This says for Alan Smart, full stop. And so this questioner really got intrigued by the concepts you were talking about in rural philanthropy and really sort of captured their imagination, and is trying to get a sense of, the overlay between the new administration's support for rural issues in terms of the aging population. Like, how do these two trends potentially coexist or overlap under this sort of new administration? And then what would you think in terms of any future structural developments or any vision you have that really effectively sort of brings these 2 points together?
Yeah, too soon to tell. I think even in the prior 3 or 5 years, we're seeing groups of, for lack of a better term, conservative and progressive funders on a national scale and sometimes on a regional scale come together in ways that are, I think, intended to reflect common interests around rural. I think there's certainly some possibilities of different kinds of conversations with people who have been very active. I mean, the political dimensions of rural and who votes and who doesn't, and hopefully to bring something positive in terms of reflecting these. We mentioned aging. My short list in rural right now, if I could, the dream:
The dream list.
childcare, rural housing, mental health, aging, all of which have very specific rural dimensions that local funders, in some ways, haven't some of its resources, some of its tradition, haven't been able to really focus on. And I think perhaps a new type of dialogue that might be possible with some of the national funders and federal side and larger family foundations that have not been active might be possible.
Okay, so I'm going to bump that back to you, Alan, because we could all guess, but I would never be so lucky as to live inside your mind. Really quickly, why that order?
Oh, that wasn't particularly rank order, but
Oh, all right.
yeah.
Well, then
I
that's
would
not a
say
fair question.
I would say those four are the least discussed, certainly on a national level and even on a local or regional level in the philanthropic community. David Lipsitz, who many of you know from Housing Assistance Corporation, so legacy um, rural housing national group, just put out something the other day about the dramatic undercount of how we document people who are rural homeless. And there's a crisis in rural rental housing that's been going on for 30 years now. So that's one of them. Mental health coming out of COVID, childcare coming out of COVID, and rural were super fragile to begin with, and now often have collapsed.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. And see, I made an assumption that wasn't even true about your ordering, about how they came off of your thinking. And we've got a number of questions, so I'm going to kind of bundle them together. About, Aaron, you referenced payout rates in one foundation that had made a special mention that they were going to, increase their payout rates. And I think there's a sense of one, if one has not worked at a foundation, and of course, if you've worked at one, you've worked at one, it's very hard to cast complete assessment over the sort of giving sector and any one sort of perspective. But it's different than if you've sort of been on not in the foundation side, in the independent sector, right? You'd sort of have less experience and access and understanding of at least some of the mechanics that may make up sort of decision making. And there's a lot of reasons, and we can go into them. We would have a whole nother webinar that would go longer than this one, and why certain foundations become, spend down. But short of that, what does it take, and what does the sector have to say, position, do, understand to sort of see this moment in time, per the questions we've been getting, and to sort of increase, their giving? Let's not connect that to the tax code rewrite. But any thoughts about having that conversation across the sector and either sharing the narrative or making the case or building understanding and a new perspective that can help to resource the nonprofits in our community and across our sector.
Yeah, the 5% payout is meant to be a floor, not a ceiling. Any foundation is free to choose to give more than that and significantly more if they want to. It is a decision that can be made by the board of trustees of that foundation. Those foundations who are super committed to existing in perpetuity often hew very closely to the 5% because they believe that that's the maximum they can do and maintain their purchasing power for generations to come. But times of crisis have led even those who are committed to perpetuity to make decisions to spend 6, 7, 8% for a period of years. And I would argue that this is one of those times. We will certainly be putting out some resources that help funders think about it. If you're not following NCRP, we just started on Blue Sky, follow us there. And of course our email list, but we'll be getting resources out. We'll be encouraging the sector to spend more in this time period. And, the funders that have decided to do it realize that the issues that they care about, if we don't hold the line or make progress on those issues now, it's going to be even harder in the future to build the kind of world that they envision and that they want us all to be able to live in. And so they think it's wiser to spend more now to at least not lose ground and possibly gain ground on those key issues. That's the crux of the argument. And for those that do want to think about spend down, I was particularly impressed with how the Chorus Foundation went about their spend out, and any funder that's thinking about that would be smart to look at how they did it. It was very
Well, I think I really do wish looking at the comments. People are thankful for the webinar and sort of asked why it was only an hour. I really could sit here all afternoon or Switzerland time all evening. But we do have to close up. So very quickly, I just want to thank everybody for coming together. Thank you for your time, your honesty, your thoughtfulness, and truly for all the work you have done and continue to do across the sector that brought you and your knowledge here today and with us and shared across the world. We are so grateful. And now I just have a few sort of closing logistical notes to make, in addition to truly my deep and great gratitude. So we will have a final slide coming up here to sort of ground us. But it really does begin where I just ended, which was great gratitude for the insightful and engaging conversation, as well as the engagement and the participation of everybody who was here with us today. Thank you for your thoughtfulness, your time, your questions, your reflections. They really continue to blossom the conversation we were privileged to have today with Aisha, Aaron, and Alan. We will follow up with an email link to the recording, and it will be available to watch on demand on our website and our YouTube channel. So I please encourage people to share that and to come back to reflect and continue to learn from what our panelists have shared with us today. You can, of course, follow the Johnson Center on LinkedIn or YouTube at Johnson Center. Please, of course, look to our website, johnsоncenter.org, where you can see more upcoming events and reports and issues that we addressed and activate knowledge with. And we truly look forward to seeing everybody again soon. So best wishes for the rest of the week. And truly, Alan, Aaron, and Aisha, cannot thank you enough. An absolute honor to be in conversation with you. Best wishes to everybody, and we'll see you soon.